Hey, one more thing before you go. What is the fascination with true crime, the paranormal, and weird history? The forgotten or the hidden stories that encapsulated communities and created the types of stories that your grandma didn't want you to hear. Stay tuned. We're going to have talk with an historian, an author, and a master storyteller. I'm your host, Michael Herst. Welcome to One More Thing Before You Go. Hey, my guest in this episode is John Brassard Jr. He's known as the Kitchen Table Historian. Great name, by the way. He's an author and historian from Eastern Ohio. Excuse me, Eastern Iowa. We knew there was going to be a foo bar somewhere in there, right? He's written 3 books about the history, legends, and the lore of Quad Cities region, and is the writer, narrator, and producer of the Kitchen Table Historian podcast. It's really good. I've listened to numerous episodes of it. You should check it out. He tells stories of true crime, paranormal, and other strange happenings throughout the Midwest, and I'm excited to have him on the show. So, welcome to the show, John.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I knew you were from Iowa. I don't know why I said Ohio.
It happens, no
Yeah,
problem.
it's one of those tongue twister, put my glasses on days. Anyway, I like to start from the beginning. As I said, you're a historian. I mean, what a fascinating opportunity to delve into your passion and then create something in the form of stories and storytelling and books and bringing other people into those stories. I think that uh, what a great life.
I enjoy it.
I would think so. It's we've always been everybody. Well, I don't know if everybody, but most everybody should be fascinated with history and how it pertains to us. And there's always little nuggets here and there that we may not always know about. And I think you kind of dig deep and delve into a few of those, and you kind of bring out some stories, as you say that your grandma says we shouldn't talk about, but we're going to talk a little bit about them now. I think. Where'd you grow up?
Well, thank you. I try. I try.
You try. I think you do a pretty good job. Where'd you grow up?
I grew up, well, right here in Eastern Iowa, right along the Quad Cities region.
And did you what was your family like?
My family was really close knit. That's where I got my, I suppose you can call it passion, you can call it knack, whatever you want to, for storytelling, because I grew up in the days pre-internet and when you only had 4 channels on the television. So we spent a lot of time talking, and a lot of that was sharing old stories about our family and about people in the neighborhood, about other people that we knew, and then sharing those stories to other people, and especially the younger generation as we all got older, because the older generation unfortunately passes away and we move forward and we remember it, they don't, and so we get to kind of recapture that through them.
I think storytelling, I mean, it's been around forever. It's been around,
Oh yeah.
you always have the elders and you always have the storytellers, back in the old tribe. And, they're the ones that you'd sit around the campfire and pass on history, pass on the lore, pass on the traditions and the cultures of society. So, taking on that role, is that's an admirable thing. Um, I had to laugh when you said about the 4 channels. I remember that. I used to be the remote control.
Yes,
Yeah, it's like, go change that channel. But
exactly.
but Dad, go move the antenna. I can't quite see that.
Yeah, I remember moving the antenna, the rabbit ears.
And well, yeah, and you compare that to today, and it's like there are what 500 channels or more out there
Oh,
that you
it's insane.
absolutely overwhelming. But I'm glad that somebody's still carrying on the storytelling aspect of life because I think storytelling is becoming a lost art a little bit. Do you agree with that?
I think it is. There's a really strong group of people, podcasters, live performers, YouTubers, etc., that really do keep it alive and keep that tradition going. And storytelling, because it's been around for so long, the medium does change somewhat and adapts to new media. It adapts to the written word, it adapts to the spoken word, it adapts to YouTube, it adapts to television, and there's all kinds of different ways that it's expanded out. It's not Honestly, it's not as prevalent as it used to be when I was growing up, but it's still going on very strong, and it's definitely not a dying art.
So it's not sitting around the campfire anymore.
Well, it depends, and it depends on where you go. Uh, in several of my workplaces, I've sat around and shared stories, and while there's not a campfire per se, there's
Mm.
a common area where you can sit and you can share something. Here recently, and it was all over the national news that one of the Quad Cities is Davenport, Iowa, and there was a building collapse in the downtown,
Mm.
and it made the national news. It was all over. People were talking about it everywhere, and the building was, appropriately enough, the Davenport, and it was apartments now, but it used to be a hotel. It was built in 1907, and one of the we were talking about it at my workplace here not too long ago, and I told him, well, a lot of people don't know this, but when it opened in 1907, it was supposed to be this big fancy hotel, and so they opened it up to kind of drum up business and interest in it. And they had all of these things in there, ashtrays and towels and letterheads and whatever else in there with the Davenport name on it. And they wanted the public to just come in there and see what they were about and hopefully get a lot of business. Well, the problem was they had to end it early because people were just stealing all this stuff with their letterhead on it
Well,
and taking off with it.
yeah, not cool. Not cool.
No.
Definitely not cool. Yeah, I think that we all yearn for knowledge of the past, no matter what age we are. I'm an older individual as well, and I miss the stories that my grandparents told me
Yes.
when they were alive. I miss sitting down and asking. I wish as a child I would have asked more questions before they were gone, because I think they would have shared more things with me that today would be jewels,
Oh,
in my
absolutely.
opinion. My sister and I will sit there and talk for, both my grandparents on both sides are passed. And I've got several aunts and uncles. It's like 9 aunts and uncles.
Oh,
There's a
wow.
number of them that have passed on as well. And, now my sister's going, I think it's up to us to continue, telling some of those stories that we did get to hear, because they're all leaving us. So
Oh, absolutely.
from a perception in that regard, I think that, what I think a message that we could probably give to everybody is that we can all be storytellers.
Oh, absolutely. I
We
agree
can all be
100%.
storytellers. Yeah. Maybe not. We don't all have to be writers to do that. We can do
No.
it verbally. We can do it that way. Um, Speaking of that, would you want to be when you grew up?
Actually, when I was real young, I wanted to be an archaeologist of all things. I think it was the Indiana Jones movies that really kind of planted that bug. I remember sitting around when I was in college and talking to two guys that were about ready to get their PhDs, and they both had the same thing for the same reasons. But I went from wanting to do something like that, which isn't too far away from history. And then I went into, well, I want to make a lot of money. And that took me down some paths that I didn't quite expect. And it was a lot of fun. And I learned a lot of things and met a lot of interesting people. However, I ended up back with history, and really it's where I belonged. And it's allowed me to go places and do things I wouldn't have otherwise, and know a lot of fun facts that make me really interesting at parties sometimes.
That's always fun. That's always fun. It's always fun. Yeah, Indiana Jones. I, I, I one time when I was a kid wanted to be an archaeologist as well, and
Oh,
my
okay.
my wife loved history, and now where we are in life right now, we thought, okay, when we start traveling, then we can do a little bit of archaeology, and we can definitely do a lot of history, because we can
Oh,
travel
yeah.
around and touch history, see history, kind of step on history where we're allowed to, of course, you
Right.
know, experience history from that perspective. So, yeah, that I can see where you were drawn from that perspective. One of my favorite shows is I don't know if you watch this or not, is Expedition Unknown
That's a great show.
with Josh Gates.
It's a
He
lot of fun.
Yeah, he brings a lot of he brings history, he brings archaeology, and he brings a lot of humor, in
Definitely.
with that as well, which I think is pretty cool. It's one of our favorites to listen to and to watch. What was your family like? I know that you are now a writer. What'd your parents do? Where did you get that inspiration from?
I just always kind of had a knack for it. We read a lot. We were a reading family. And so I spent a lot of time with my nose in a book when I was growing up. And my mom was a lot the same way my dad was. And I was influenced by their separate tastes. They were both interested in history. My mom was interested in different facets of history than my dad was, but I kind of took them both under my wing. It's kind of like anything else, from music to movies to whatever. You get a little bit from your dad, you get a little bit from your mom. And for me, it just kind of combined in this weird amalgamation of, I had a knack for really weird things. And so I liked reading about it. I liked writing about it. And it took me a while to come to the writing thing. But as a historian, if you're not reading about something, if you're not telling somebody about something, then you're writing about it and sharing it with other people. Now, in history, it's supposed to be original research. And when I was going through college and going down that path, I never quite expected that my original research would be in the places that it went to.
Now, is your history research and your history, if everything that you're doing, not just aside from your books, do you primarily concentrate in the Midwest area, or do you go outside of that?
I concentrate a lot in the Midwest area because it seems the Midwest is slightly underrepresented. And the one thing that I've found is that even then, because you can't exactly generalize it.
Right.
So places with larger urban areas. Chicago has a lot written about it. St. Louis has a little more, or has just a little bit less written about it. And there's authors in different places, but there are places of the Midwest that are almost completely untouched. Iowa is one of them. Iowa, South Dakota, North Dakota, certain parts of, well, Missouri's not really the Midwest, but certain parts of Missouri outside the large urban areas, they're virtually untouched and people don't know a lot about them. And people have this concept of Iowa in particular that, well, everybody's so friendly and everybody will shake your hand and they'll stop to help you. Well, after some of the stuff that I write and talk about, I'd be a little careful about who I'd let stop and help you.
I was going to just bring that up. I listened to parts of your podcast. It's like, well, wait a minute. Especially coming from a cop's perspective, I'm kind of
Oh,
going,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. I just stop and think about that one there for a second. I don't know if I do that or not. Yeah, it's and for those of you that are watching and listening, we're going to talk about Joan's website. You can see it scroll across the bottom, but you'll find some interesting photographs on there as well. And and I knew it that I should have written this down. The big nose guy. Who is that?
Big Nose George, he was
Big nose
actually out
George.
west.
Out west. I thought he might be out west. Um, how did you come about him on your website?
One of my fans actually contacted me and asked me, "Have you ever heard about this?" And I looked it up, and actually, there's a certain number of stories on my website and on my podcast that came from fans. I'd never heard about this stuff, and there's a lot of
Oh,
local things that you never hear about. There's nobody out there that knows everything.
right.
And she told me about it, and I was like, "What is this?" And I was fascinated by the story, and so of course I needed to share.
Yeah, I think, Big Nose George, I've heard the stories of Big Nose George out here. That's why I was wondering how you came about that connection. Again, I've listened to some of your podcasts, but I haven't listened to them all yet. But I'm working on it because
I
you really
appreciate
have,
that.
yeah, you have some fascinating stories on there. I just listened to the one with the where the woman was murdered. She was the whack, and
Oh, yeah.
yeah, yeah, very, and still to this day hasn't been solved.
No.
Yeah, which is really from my perspective as a retired law enforcement officer. That's something I say, wow, that really needs solving. Somebody needs to go in there get some justice in regard to that. But it's something that I was not aware of, coming from either Colorado or, now living in Arizona, you know,
Right.
we're not aware of some things like that. But I guess that goes on anywhere we are, whether it be a small town or a large town. And that's kind of where a little bit of where you bring those stories out, right?
Yes, very much so. I I grew up in a lot of rural Iowa. I touched on some of the bigger urban areas too, but in rural Iowa, everybody, like I said, there's that idea that everybody's your friend and everybody's going to stop and help you and they're going to shake your hand and invite you over to dinner. And in urban areas, any urban area over a certain size, people start getting a little more paranoid because
Mhm.
crime goes up. And in rural Iowa, there were so many cases or so many instances of what they call family annihilation murders, of
Mhm.
people killing, spousal murder, all kinds of nasty things out there. And there was one story in particular from Western Iowa, and Western Iowa is extremely, Southwestern Iowa in particular is extremely rural. And there was a story that I came across about a guy. He had, sorry about that, something went off in the
Uh,
living room. Anyway, a lost my train of thought there for a minute. Just one moment.
about extremely rural Iowa and the
Ah,
guy.
anyway, he had remarried. His first wife had died. He remarried. He had two biological children of his own. He had two stepchildren. And for whatever reason, he decided to murder his two stepchildren and his stepwife or his second wife over the breakfast table one morning. No rhyme or reason. And I actually had opportunity to go out to where this took place. The house was still standing at the time. And there's nothing out there. I mean, this is the last place in the world. This is not the
That
south
you would
side of
think.
Chicago, you know. This is not New York in the 1970s. I mean, this was just rural Iowa, lots of farmland. You would never have any
Yeah.
idea that this would have taken place there.
Pretty brutal. I mean, I listened to that episode also. It was pretty brutal in regard to how it took place and the methodology and trying to understand why
Oh yeah.
that he did this. So yeah, very fascinating story. What got you interested in the paranormal aspect? Was it investigating these type of things?
I've always had a thing for ghost stories. I am a sucker for a good ghost story. I have since I was a
Me too.
kid. And I I'm just fascinated by the phenomena. I'm fascinated by people. And as you get older, you talk to people. So at first it was just casual conversation. You would talk to people that wanted to share these stories with you. And then it became, as my reputation as being kind of an oddball grew, I had more and more people approach me with their stories. And I actually had one guy tell me, it's like, of all the people I know that you would just listen to me and take me seriously. Like, okay, I guess thank you, but it was a great story. But at the same time, I mean, you have these people approach you with these, and there are some really strange things out there. I mean, and to be perfectly honest with you, and as a former police officer, you'll understand this. Some people are just pulling your leg for whatever reason they get out of it. They pull your leg with it. But there's a lot of people and that have experienced something. You can tell the difference between the two, I think, a lot of the time.
You
And you
can.
listen to it and it's like, I just can't put my finger on that. I have no explanation for that whatsoever.
Yeah, it's interesting when you deal with individuals that either are trying to get the attention by coming up with a story like that, a very elaborate story, but you usually can tell the ones that are factual and the ones that really have some substance to them compared to the ones that are going, "Hey, I got a story for you,"
Right.
and it's really a story.
Oh yeah.
Kind of one of those things. It's. I think we're all interested in the paranormal. That's the reason part of this podcast is we talk about the paranormal and the supernatural because we all have a fascination with it. And again, that also comes, I think, with age too, because the older we get, the more we want to know what's on the other side.
Oh, absolutely.
What's really there? What's going to happen to me? That kind of a thing. Or when we lose people, you always have we always have that question, Kuhn, I didn't get to say. one of the reasons, one more thing before you go, was started in the first place was for people to get closure because they never got to say what they wanted to say before somebody walked out the door, and then life changed in an instant.
Right.
And so I think from that perspective, I think we all have just a little bit, unless you're an atheist, I guess, we all have this little intrigue with ghost and the other side and the supernatural and what the possibility exists out there. Are you collecting any of these stories to maybe form another book?
Actually, yes, I am. I wanted to write something different, and I have another book coming out next year. Shameless plug inserted here. And that is actually more true crime. But I co-authored a ghost book with another local author, and that was kind of a spur of the moment thing. I didn't expect to, and he had run into some personal trouble, and he asked, "Hey, would you come help me out with this?" And so, yeah, okay. And it was a interesting experience. But I've always wanted to write one of my own, and one of the things I didn't want to write just another, well, here's this thing and it's haunted and yay. I wanted to do something a little different. And so what I'm working on are stories that they seem fairly normal, but they have an oddball twist to them. That's not exactly it. Okay, so for instance, there was in the 1920s, there was a local insurance guy who was coming back from some kind of function with his wife, another insurance salesman, regional manager, and his wife's caregiver. And they got in this horrific train accident. Well, it was at a railroad crossing where it took place. And right before they came into this intersection, this crossing, there was a newspaper delivery man and his companion. It was another newspaper delivery guy, and they were in a truck. They had just gone through. They were about half a mile distant. They didn't hear anything. They didn't see anything. Nothing. And all of a sudden, the driver and the roads are nasty. It's a nasty, ugly winter night. The roads are icy. It's dangerous out. It's slick. And he starts pulling around to go back to the intersection. And his friend says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "There's been a wreck. That car behind us has been in a wreck." And how do you know? I don't know, but I know. And they drove back, and it was this awful scene. And they ended up saving a couple of the people there, ended up saving their lives because, I mean, they were on fire at the time. So, I mean, and the train crew had actually stopped and ran back, but they wouldn't have been able to get there in time. So, I mean, why did that happen? What what was that? So it's that kind of story with that strange supernatural tinge to it, that just a little taste of what else is out there. Why did you see that? Kind of like there's instances of warning ghosts or
Right.
strange dreams or things like that. And so it's more a book about that.
Well, I think that we got a little exclusive. Thank you.
I'm
See,
here
you
for
gave me a
you, man.
shameless plug, but you also gave me an exclusive, so it's okay.
I'm batting 1,000 so far.
It works. It balanced out, right? Uh, it's interesting. I know from my own experiences, especially on the job and walking into, deep, dark buildings in the middle of the night or
Oh
walking up
yeah.
to a car, you get that little angel on your shoulder that kind of whispers in your ear and gives you just a little bit of inclination that it makes you wonder, who is it that told me not to do that or not to go there or to go there?
Right.
That's what a fascinating approach, an interesting approach actually to writing the book instead of just telling the ghost story.
Well,
You're going
thank
to
you.
tell, yeah, a little bit more from the outside, a little bit of more intrigue with the possibility of what does exist and, how we interact with that possibility. Yeah, very
I
cool.
am I love good ghost stories and I love hauntings, but I think it's not an unexplored phenomena, but I think it's an overlooked phenomena. That idea of premonitions and warning signs and things, because they're so. you want another exclusive. So my dad, my great grandfather was murdered several years ago in Mason City. It's in Mason City, Iowa. It's still an unsolved murder up there. When my dad was a young man, he went up there to stay with him to visit, and there was a cot down in his basement. And that's where my great grandfather told my dad to stay. And so dad's like, okay, no problem. And so he lays down on that cot and he could not get comfortably, couldn't sleep, couldn't deal with it. So I ended up going upstairs, sleeping on the floor or the couch or something. Well, a couple weeks later, my great grandfather was actually murdered on the same cot.
Wow.
No rhyme, no reason, but I mean, what, why do people get those feelings? Where do they
Yeah.
come from?
Divine, or a guardian
Right,
angel, or you know, or a relative that's passed on that's whispering in your ear.
right,
So
exactly.
yeah, what an interesting approach, or an interesting aspect. I think you got something there. It's unique, and it gives us the opportunity to think about the possibility of what's actually out there. And I like books like that as well. I like thinking that way, because you never know. I can't tell you how many times I walked someplace, or I didn't go around that corner, and it was a positive, or I went, oh, I better stop and go back, and went back, and one of my guys was, having making a contact with an individual in the 7-Eleven parking lot. I thought, maybe I better go back there, and I did, and I pulled in and watched the guy walking up, and he had a 45 in the small of his back,
Oh,
tucked
wow.
into his jeans, and
Right.
he was acting like nothing, blah blah blah, just talking up a storm, and Gary had no clue. Gary thought it was just some guy walking up saying hi. So
Sure.
you never know. You never know what could be out there that's going to whisper in your ear to tell you to do this or not to do this. So yeah, good luck on that. I hope I'm looking forward
Thank
to
you.
that when that one comes out. You're gonna have to let me know when that comes out, so
All right.
I can jump on that right away.
All
Um,
right. Sounds good.
so as a historian, what's your process in writing a book, for example? Your latest. Tell me about your latest book and what your inspiration was for that.
My latest book was called Erie Quad Cities. That was I co-authored with uh, another local guy, and he had already come up with some of the stories and the format that he wanted to do it, and it was just kind of one bad luck scenario after another for him. His first co-author, he had written a previous book. This was kind of a follow-up to his first
Mm,
book, and his co-author for that one wanted nothing to do with it. He wanted to move on, and so that was, you have to accept that.
right.
And then he had taken on a new job, and his position, it was really busy, and he's like, I don't have time to do this. I need help with this. I'm not going to make my deadlines. So he contacted me, who he talked to about the first book, and he asked me, do you want to help me write this ghost book? And I always kind of had an interest in it, so I'm like, yeah, sure, why not? And so one thing led to another. We got the book done. It was a pretty positive experience. It was a lot of fun, but there were other stories that came about because of there were stories that he had on the original format, and then there were stories that I wanted to put in there to share. And the thing is, there's different ways of discovering stories, and that's always your initial contact. You can discover them in the newspaper, you can hear a local legend, you can hear it from a friend, you can hear it from on the TV news. Wherever you hear it from, now you have to follow up on it. So then you go on and you learn about the story, you learn about the venue. So one of the contributing stories that I made was this small town legend. It was Cambridge, Illinois, which is a small town in Western Illinois. And they're one of many, many, many towns across the US that have a death curve. And generally, it's where a lot of car accidents happen, or uh, there's either death or just wrecks, period. It all depends on the legend. The legends differ. Well, I started looking at it and I'd heard about it, and I had heard about this. So I'd heard about it, and I can't remember exactly where they had said, but they mentioned a name, this woman named Julia Markham, and she's the ghost that allegedly haunts the death curve. and causes your car to wreck. I'm like, all right, let's see what I can do. And I found out that aside from the story, it was based in a very, very real event. And this woman named Julia Markham, she married young, and her husband was a farmer, and they lived on a farm which was outside this death curve, and or where it was located. And in the early 1900s, her husband had gone to help harvest or work in a fellow farmer's field, and she was severely mentally ill, and she ended up murdering all five of their children in a very systematic fashion, and then she set her house on fire. And her idea was is that she was going to die in the fire. Well, it didn't work out the way she wanted. She had attempted suicide. It didn't, it was not successful, and she actually escaped from the house, but she was severely burned, and a lot of smoke inhalation and everything that goes with that. And everybody around had seen this fire, and they saw the smoke from it, and so they all came up, and everybody's trying to put it out. And they discovered what happened, and she ended up confessing before she died of what she had done. And ever since then, her ghost had allegedly been seen around the death curve itself, along the road leading up to it, and then around the barn area. There used to be a barn standing on the property, and that was there for years and years and years. I actually talked to a woman who lived there. This is a few years ago now, and she said that when she was in high school, she remembered being in the barn and friends who had ghost stories with it. And it was one of those things. It's you have a legend that ends up based in fact, at least in that there was an event associated with it, and then you have ghost stories that stem from that. And of course the death curve legend was there, but she was telling me stories, and some of the locals were telling me stories about it that were just bizarre. It's a long stretch of rural road that goes up to this. And the story she told me is that there were two kids. They're probably 12, 13 years old, maybe a little older, maybe a little younger, and they were riding their bikes down the road. There's nobody else around, and they see this woman wearing white, and she's just walking down the road, and they kind of ride by and they say hi, or and she doesn't talk to him, she doesn't respond. And they keep riding, and one of them turned around, and this is still within plain view, and she's gone. And they have no idea what happened to her. There was no place for her to go. And so that's one of the local ghost stories that came from it. So it's just this bizarre chain that came about, and it was just too interesting to not write about and share with the Quad Cities in general.
That what an amazing story. Number one, from my old profession, that's something that would fascinate me as to why.
Right.
My first question would be, why does she do this? And because I have investigated crimes that we had a guy that attacked and killed his 6-year-old little girl, saying that the devil was in her.
Really.
The guy was really lost it. But
Right.
when you bring him in to interview, he thought nothing. He thought there was nothing wrong. He said, "I did it because she had the devil in her." I mean, it was just matter of fact. It wasn't. You can tell he was not trying to create a story or fabricate a story to cover his butt for what he did, for losing his temper or something like that. He actually believed it, and it just kind of makes you wonder. This when you would come up with that story, did you go to the location and actually check it out, or
So it was kind of a strange event. I wrote about it, and because I had all the historical details and everything, and I went in through the historical process, I went through records, I went through everything that I could. And so I had written about it, and a local lady who worked at the library, she contacted me. And at the time, the town wanted to put on this whole ghost event, and what it ended up boiling down to was that I came in and gave a talk at their library.
Mm,
And library talks are, you never know how many people you're going to get. I've had as little as 3, and I've had as many as I think 50 or 60 at a
Wow.
library. So I mean, it's kind of a grab bag, and this was a really big turnout. And I was sharing these stories, and I shared, and the whole thing I was going to talk about the story behind the Cambridge death curve. And what was really interesting about it is that, first of all, these people are sharing their local stories, and they were sharing stories of true crime. They were sharing, yeah, over at this house, did you see that driving in? Yeah, this guy killed his mom over there in 1971. I'm like, what? Okay, and they're just sharing this kind of stuff off the top of their head. And this is stuff that they had lived with, small town things, and they knew, some of them knew the people, some of them were sharing ghost stories, some of them were just talking about it, kind of speculating about it. And then I had this gal come up at the end, and she said, and she was talking to me about things, and she was the one that shared the ghost story with me. And she says, well, have you been out to the graves? No, I haven't. I've seen pictures of them, but I haven't been out to the cemetery yet.
Of the
And at
woman and the kids.
right. And they were buried in a mass grave out there, because yeah, it was one big grave, and
I understand.
they were very poor, and a lot of things were donated. And I was not getting around very well at the time. I had some personal health problems. I had just undergone one of what ended up being 3 major surgeries. And so I was getting around good enough, but I was kind of, do I really want to go looking for graves
Hmm.
in the cemetery? I wasn't quite as confident in my ability to do that at the time. And she said, well, come on, I'll drive you out there and I'll show you, or you just follow my car and I'll take you out. And I'm like, okay, cool. So we ended up going out there, and we were looking at it. And what was interesting is that it was initially an unmarked grave. And that was the story. They were buried in an unmarked grave because they couldn't afford a headstone. Well, someone had gone out within the last 2 years. And because she was saying, I was out at such and such a time, and this was still unmarked, and somebody had actually paid to have a headstone set with their names on it, which
Hmm.
was pretty cool. So she was all excited about that. And then she looks at me, she says, well, do you want to go see the death curve? It's only a little bit down the road. Yeah, I want to go see the death curve. Let's go see this thing. And so
I
we went
twist my
out there.
arm.
And so we get out there, and we're looking at it, and really, the barn's gone, the house burnt down in the early 1900s, but it's still, you're there, and you
Right.
can let your imagination go. And there's nothing out there. I mean, there's farms nearby, but there's nothing around this area. It's a very rural road. I mean, it's not gravel, but I mean, it's
Mhm.
old blacktop. And you would never guess. I would have driven past this 20 times
Without
and never
knowing.
guessed. Yeah. It's like, this is the death curve. Like, really? Okay. I mean, maybe if I saw a woman in white jump out in front of my car, I'd have a clue then, but without that. So I mean, it was really neat. And then as we're standing there, she's sharing these stories. I think that was where she actually shared the story of the 2 guys on the bicycle and seeing the ghost. And then there
Embark
were,
Point.
yeah,
Just
and it was,
storytelling perpetuating on storytelling, which is pretty cool, actually.
yeah,
Yeah, I
I
think
enjoy that.
we all have a fascination with true crime. I think because we all, I mean, look back at so many Black Dahlia, and I mean, you can. Let me try that in English. I'm getting too excited here. It is interesting because if we look back on history, the reason they make documentaries like the Black Dahlia or the Manson murders or the Ted Bundy, any one of these, because we all have a fascination with true crime. But we want to know why. We want to know how that happened, why that happened, what was the motivation. Not just from like my perspective as an investigator. I always wanted to be a cop because I loved investigating. I love digging into stuff and finding out, the origins and figuring out the what, where, why, when, and how.
Right.
The one of the reasons I became a cop was for that because I was intrigued by that investigation portion of it, and I still do it to now. In fact, I irritate my wife and kids because we'll be watching a show and I go, "They did it. They did it. That's happened. That happened." I go, "You're not watching this anymore with us." uh, so it's to be able to take that and then take your passion, and then combine that with your passion of writing, and then present something to us, has got to be just an absolutely wonderful feeling that I'm sure that you have a self satisfaction type within yourself with regard to, hey,
Yes.
here, I got something for you. Here's a little tidbit. Here's a little something that you really didn't know about. Um, on a side note, anytime we travel, I always call the police department and I say, okay, so where don't I stay? What happened there? Just,
That is not a bad idea. That's actually a really good idea.
it is, sometimes you get good answers. Sometimes they'll say, well, I can't tell you that. But, a lot of times you'll get them and say, well, this happened there, or this happened there, and this happened, or that happened. And, kind of gives you just a little tidbit of information from the
Right.
inside, that you can grasp onto, if that's the right word, just to know. Because, well, I don't, we'll talk after this here a little more in depth, but I don't want to go too in depth with it. But yeah, you might try that. Just give a local
Yeah.
police department a call and say, hey, I'm going to be in the area and this is what I'm doing, and anything interesting, and that might expand your horizons just a little bit more as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I will give that a try.
So, how long did it take to write your first book?
I so our first my first book was co-authored with my dad. My dad and I talked for years about writing a book together. And it was just talk, kind of sit around watching TV talk or driving down the road talk. And one day he comes over and he says, "Hey, I called the publisher with this idea that we had. They like it. They're going to call you back." Uh okay. So I ended up talking to this guy, and I feel very much kind of like a third wheel here because I wasn't involved in any of these conversations. So I am I'm new to this whole thing. I mean, I was a historian. I mean, I had my degree and my background. So now I'm trying to impress this guy because yeah, this sounds really cool. And so I'm trying to come off as very professional and whatever. We ended up getting the book, and it was dad and I wrote it 50-50. Not all collaborations work out that way, but everything balanced out, and we wrote it for fun. The second book I wrote, I always said that once I got settled in and things were okay with my family and whatever, I was going to write. I was going to sit down, I was going to start writing. And I did. And it started out with local newspapers, and I had moved down. I had always lived in the northern part of the county or just north of the Quad Cities. And we ended up moving down to the Quad Cities proper. And I was down there, and I was trying to gain my traction and build my reputation, and I was going about it in a lot of wrong ways. I was chasing things, and I was thinking, well, I could volunteer and I could do this, and you said, well, we have positions where you can run the front desk and talk to customers, and I'm thinking this isn't exactly what I want to do. And I remember looking at this book sitting in their gift shop where they told me this. And I thought, that's what I want to do. And I remember this is how we went about this process before. So I got this idea. I want to write a true crime book. So let's contact him and spin him a story and just throw it at him and see if it sticks. And by God, they accepted it. And it took me almost a year. I think it ended up being 7 to 9 months, and that was I was really had no process. I had no idea what I was doing a lot of the time. I mean, I knew how to research things. I knew how to find things. I knew where to find it. But there are certain sources, and there's certain sources with everything, and certain records. There's military records and court records, and this record and that record, and there's I'm sure you'll understand, there's particular documents that deal with police investigation, uh, coroner's records and true crime in particular. And it was, okay, how do I find this stuff? And I'm kind of discovering this stuff as I go. And I remember one in particular, I had written the story out and I had it and everything was going great with it. And I went into the coroner's inquest records and there were witnesses that were giving an entirely different story than what I had found. And they were given parts of the story that I'd never seen before. And I had no full idea of what an impact a coroner's inquest could have and a different perspective they could give. I'd used the records before, but the last time I'd done it, everything was pretty true to what had already been reported. And this time, there were all kinds of details. So I ended up going back and rewriting it. And there were other records involved. In some of the stuff I did later, there were prison records that I found that you all of a sudden you had access to because of online things. And so it took me a lot longer than I expected. I mean, I thought, well, yeah, I can just sit down and hammer this out. No, no. So I mean, about 9 months later, I had a final draft, and then going through the process. And before I had my dad to kind of help me out, and we wrote a different kind of book. And this one was it was and also in the process of it, I was finding my voice as a writer, which always sounds so cliche and kind of silly to my ears, but it's also very true because everybody has a way of telling a story. Everybody has their own unique perspective, and it's going to come out in the written word just as well as anything else. But in the written word, there's so many ways to present things. There's technical writing and there's formal writing and there's this writing. And when you're just telling a story on the page, you kind of have to find your feel for it. And it took me a while to find it. And that book really helped me to get there. But it also made the process a lot longer than I initially thought it was going to go.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I know that you'll understand this from that perspective as well. I have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, and
Hmm.
I had to learn to stop writing from an academic perspective.
Yes, very much
Um,
so.
there's a huge difference between a research paper or a thesis, or a journal, you know, in and writing either a nonfiction book or a fiction book. So,
Right.
I do understand having to find your voice in regard to that because you have to kind of separate yourself, especially if you've got academia training. They drill into you a specific format and a specific way of doing things and, documenting things and a specific way of researching things, which I'm sure helped you in regard to some of your research. But at
Right.
the same time, that's we as readers don't. We want to be able to enjoy the book, not
Right.
from another research perspective. I guess from that perspective. Um, but obviously, you found your voice now, and now you're going to move forward with regard to more books that you're going to present. And I think that to me, to being able to take that passion and turning into something creative from that point. Again, it's got to be a great feeling in regard to a finished product and presenting that to the world and looking at it. Like you said, you were sitting at a desk and you looked over and saw that book. People can't see me, but looked over and saw that book over there and thought, that's what I want to do. So very cool. Very cool. What did may I ask, what did your dad do before he decided to write a book with you?
He worked in the nuclear power industry for 40 some odd years.
Well, that's different.
Yeah, really
uh,
super smart guy and always had a real interest in history. And he was a really good researcher. He's a very, very good researcher, but he didn't always know how to present it well. When he was telling a story, he could tell a really good story
mm,
and he had a real knack for finding oddball stuff. I think I get it from him. And, but when it came to writing it down, he not only did he not really have a knack for that part of it, but he didn't really want to learn how to do it either. He was
mhm.
satisfied. And so that's where him and I complemented one another with that.
That helps. That helps. That helps immensely. Let's talk about your books. If somebody was looking to get the hold of them, you are known as the kitchen table historian. Which brilliant name. How'd you come about that?
I needed a name for the podcast because I kept saying, and this is going to be slightly long-winded, so bear with me. My family finally got me to do a podcast because I said I should do that. It would be fun. Yeah, you'd be really good at it. And then for the next year or 2 years, I kept talking about it, and I think I got them so irritated with me that every time I mentioned it, they were practically throwing things at me. And so it became, I'm going to do this. And I needed a title for it and I couldn't think anything. I'm like, what would he? And well, I like to sit at the kitchen table and tell stories. And that's what we used to do when I was growing up. And that sounds great. And so I went with the kitchen table historian, and that's where I got the name.
Well, that's brilliant, actually. So well done in that
Thank
regard. Again, you got 3 books. Let's talk about those real quick and how somebody can find your books and your podcast, please.
Okay, so my 3 books are Scott County Cemeteries, Murder and Mayhem in Scott County, Iowa, and Erie Quad Cities. You can find all 3 of them for our friends abroad. For locals, they can find it at some of the local bookstores. They still carry all 3. And you can find all 3 at Amazon.com and other major booksellers. Barnes & Noble still carries it too. My website is www.johnbrassardjr.com. You can find what books I have. I believe I have links to the Amazon sites on them, and you can also have access to my podcast. And for every podcast, I actually do a script of it so you can read it if you prefer.
That's helpful, very helpful. And I'll make sure those are in the show notes too, so everybody has an easy way just to click on it and to follow it to the Kitchen Table Historian.
Very cool.
Well, thank you very much for coming on and sharing your journey with us. I really appreciate it. It's, I love the fact that you combine history with true crime. That's what a brilliant way to introduce yourself to the world as a writer and as a historian. I think that coming from a cop's perspective, it's like, damn, why didn't I think of that? But here we are. It's all good. So thank you very much for sharing that journey. I appreciate what you bring to the world, and I'm looking forward to reading your books. Actually, I haven't had the opportunity to do that yet, but I am looking forward to reading them because the podcast is fascinating, and you all need to come take a listen to his podcast as well. There's heads up, some of it is very descriptive. So if you listen to it and you have children in the house, you might want to put earbuds in or have them go out and play for a little bit. But it's a brilliant podcast. Well,
thank you,
John. This is one more thing before you go. So before we go, do you have any words of wisdom for any new budding historian or writer?
Find your own voice and don't be afraid to find your own niche and follow it. If you're interested, there's a history of everything. If you're interested in the history of cars, if you're interested in the history of dirt, if you're interested in the history of anything, then you're probably going to find somebody willing to listen to it. And it's all important. It all deserves to be learned. And you never know when somebody's going to find it handy. So get out there, learn about it, write about it, share about it.
Outstanding words of wisdom. I really appreciate it. I will have links to everything about you and how to get a hold of your books and listen to your podcast on the website as well in the show notes. So thank you very much for being here. All of you out there, one more thing before you go, from my perspective, have a great day. Have a great week. And thanks for listening. And thank you, John.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of One More Thing Before You Go. Check out our website at beforeyougopodcast.com. You can find us as well as subscribe to the program and rate us on your favorite podcast listening platform.